Second practice, second thing I do when working cases that I think we could apply to how we investigate the resurrection, or anything actually in the Gospels, and that is we have to think about the nature of evidence broadly. We have to think about the nature of evidence broadly. In other words, we're asking this question, what qualifies as evidence? Now you might say, well, forensic physical evidence of the scene. That's true. Evidence I can test that's physical is true, but also non-physical evidence at the crime scene is also non-forensic evidence. Some of the evidence can't be tested with forensics. Some of it can. Some of it with forensic sciences, but some of it's not even going to be physical. So it turns out that both sides, both kinds of things could qualify as evidence. Both kinds of things could be used in a criminal trial to make a case. Both forensic physical evidence and non-forensic physical. Hey, how about this? Where the victim was attacked, you realize that where the victim was attacked is an important piece of evidence. It can determine really who we're looking for. Could it be anybody, or was it somebody who knew her? Often we know that based on the location. But guess what? Where the victim could have been attacked but wasn't, that's also of evidential value to us in a case. Do you see now, again, the two opposites are both valuable to us. Here's another one. Items discovered at the crime scene. Of course, stuff you discover at the crime scene, that could be used as evidence. How about this? Stuff that is missing from the crime scene. Well, that also has evidential value. Do you see the pattern here? How about this? Words the suspect said. Well, that would count. How about words the suspect could have said but didn't? Yeah, that also counts. How about this? Something the suspect did. Well, yeah, of course that would count. How about this? Something the suspect could have done but decided not to do, or for whatever reason didn't do. Well, yep, that would also. Do you see what's happening here? So it turns out that with categories, the scope of what can be used evidentially to make a case is much broader than you think. Everything and anything has the potential to be used to build an evidential case in criminal trials. This is true. Same is true, though, when we're making a case for Christianity. Well, we have some internal textual evidence from Scripture. Well, of course we could use that to make a case, but we could also use external non-textual evidence. Well, how about this? Where did the event occur as recorded in Scripture? Well, that's going to be important to us, but where the event could have occurred but didn't, that's also going to be important. Well, how about this? The stuff that was described, right, by the author, whatever the gospel author is, of course, that's got evidential importance, but the stuff he left out, that's also of evidential importance to us. How about this? He describes that certain words were said by one person in the account, either Jesus or somebody else. Well, the words that person said, that's going to count. But it turns out the words they failed to say will also be important to our investigation. Whatever they did is important. Whatever they failed to do. Do you see what's happening here? It turns out, you used to think, well, what's on that page, that's what's what's not on the page also counts. And we have to kind of look at this differently. I often am more concerned about I always say it this way to my daughters: be careful what you say, because I'm going to hold everything against you. And they hate that, of course. But the point is, it's broader than you think. And I want us to keep that open, broad funnel of evidence in mind as we begin to examine the case for the resurrection. A lot more counts than you think counts. Everything has the potential to be part of an evidential case. Now, just before we go to the next principle, I just want to answer an objection I hear a lot that just drives me nuts. So here's the objection. It's something like this. You'll hear this said in the past. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. And it's often used in the context of this second objection. If God exists, this idea, this quote, this claim, God exists, that's an extraordinary claim. You had better be able to produce extraordinary evidence to support such a claim. Well, what do you mean by extraordinary? I mean, what exactly? My own experience with this is slightly different. Let me explain to you what I mean. I had a case, which I described in the last session, in which a woman was killed by her husband in 1981, and there was no body. This is a case that appeared on Dateline, and as I investigated this case, as you can see here, I realized that, man, this event The murder of this man, this man murdering his wife, was in many ways, like lots of murders, incredibly extraordinary. Let me give you an example of this. It turns out in 1981, there were about 24 million people living in our state. Of those 24 million people, about 3,000, just a little over 3,000, were murdered, or committed murder, I should say. That's 0.01% of the entire population of California. That's pretty extraordinary. That's a very small number. This is not a common thing or an ordinary occurrence. This is an extraordinary occurrence if you think about it, right? And it turns out, of all these people who committed murder, 0.01% of the population of California who committed murder, one of them, just one, was a guy named Michael Lubon. He was 0.000004% of the population. That's an extraordinarily small and rare. This dude was special, right? And exceptional, if you think about it. Not just ordinary. This is not an ordinary event. This is, by the way, most murders, well, all murders are, given the number of people who live in our country and the people who commit crimes in our country, they are extraordinary events. But this is even more extraordinary event because, as I told you in the last session, we didn't work this as a homicide for 6 years after it was reported as a missing person. We had a missing person report, nothing else. 6 years later, someone decides, well, she never came back. That doesn't happen. I mean, you tell me that she never came back. She left 2 small children. She never once called. She never, this is a murder investigation. We're like working it as a murder now, but now we're 6 years behind the curve. So in addition to this being very rare in terms of the number of people who are living in California, this is even rarer in terms of murders because we had no physical evidence and we had no body. And as you can see here, we had no crime scene and we had no one's cooperation. That's right. He's not going to cooperate with us. His family doesn't think he's guilty. Worse yet, Carol, his wife, their family loved Mike. They didn't believe Mike was capable of doing this. They didn't want to lose both their daughter and their beloved son-in-law. They weren't cooperative either. So we have a case now that's rare to begin with, but now it's even more rare because it's in a unique case. This guy had no history of violence. Most murderers we can go back and find at some point they had a history of violence. Not here. And guess what? On top of it all, this is a case in which there was no apparent motive for Mike to do this to his wife. Now that's, okay, this is a terrible case. This is why this stayed open for so many years. This is an extraordinary, unusual case, given that any murder in California, believe it or not, as you might not think it's so, but it is so. You just saw the numbers. It's extraordinary on its own. But not only that, this case is even more extraordinary based on the nature of the case. And this is why the sister of the deceased, the sister of the victim, basically said, no, I don't believe it. I don't believe Mike did this. Basically, you're going to have to show me some extraordinary evidence in order for me to believe that. There's just no way. Now, okay, we get to trial. Here he is in trial. And I will tell you that everything has evidential use, right? We talked earlier about how to think broadly about evidence. The same was true here during his criminal trial. So we're looking at, where was Carol killed? Where wasn't Carol killed? What did Michael say afterwards? What did he fail to say when interviewed afterwards? What did Michael do? What did he fail to do? Do you see what we're doing here? The same thing I showed you in the last segment. We are using very ordinary evidence, very unexceptional evidence. It's the same way we approach everything in order to make this case. So it turns out we can solve extraordinary murders using very ordinary evidence. You don't need extraordinary evidence. We don't need some crazy test that's been devised in the last 5 years and now we're going to bring it in with, and make it a hologram. No, we're not going to do any of that. We're going to use very ordinary evidence, the stuff I just told you about, the stuff we use in every case. Now let's take a look at this and apply this to, say, for example, the existence of God. Now, what's going to be used to make a case for the existence of God? Do I need extraordinary evidence to prove this extraordinary, unusual claim? Not really. I'm going to use all the kinds of ordinary evidence I would use. Forensic evidence, non-forensic evidence, where the phenomena occurs, where phenomena don't occur. What is discovered in the universe? What do we see about the nature of the universe? What's missing from the nature of the universe? What do the gospel authors, when it comes to Christianity in specific, what do they say? What do they fail to say? What did Jesus do? What did Jesus not do? In other words, we're going to make the case for this extraordinary claim called Christianity using very ordinary, unexceptional forms of evidence, because this is how we prove every extraordinary case, using the same approach we use to doing anything else. Now, let's just take one last thing here. Looking at the universe, okay, if we're going to suggest, and I believed this for years as an atheist, I rejected anything extranatural. If it couldn't be explained with space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, I believe we would eventually just be patient. We will eventually explain it with those things. That's all you had. It's the only explanations that could ever exist were those that employed space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. I was a philosophical naturalist. But if we're going to suggest that the universe leapt into existence from nothing and appears fine-tuned without a fine-tuner, and life emerges from non-living, these forces of physics and chemistry can create life from non-living matter that appears to be designed when there's no designer, and that there's consciousness somehow emerges, immaterial consciousness somehow emerges from matter, from material, and there's somehow the appearance or the emergence of freedom, of free agency just pops in here, even though the system itself is deterministic, and somehow there are moral obligations to physics. I mean, and there's we're only morally obligated to persons, but if we're going to suggest all of this comes from just space, time, matter, and physics, well, that really would be an extraordinary claim. And it seems to me then the burden goes right back to the other person to have as much extraordinary evidence, because those claims are even far more extraordinary than ours.